The season of Advent starts off dramatically in today's gospel. Jesus is answering a question from his disciples about the end times, and he doesn't sugarcoat it. Before today's reading picks up, Jesus has already told his disciples of coming wars, of famine, of suffering for the sake of the kingdom. The signs will be clear. The sun and moon will be darkened. The stars will fall from the sky. This passage is apocalyptic, literally. Scholars call this teaching of Jesus the little apocalypse to distinguish it from the book of Daniel, which Jesus references. Apocalyptic stories and predictions were well known to Jesus' listeners. Today's Old Testament lesson reflects the theme. The prophet Isaiah prays for God to tear open the heavens so that the mountains would quake. The prophet longs for those days of old when God did awesome things that we did not expect. One commentary I consulted suggests that whenever times are really bad, people may welcome even the prospect of an end to the world as they know it. And first century Jews could look back on persecutions, exile in Babylon, and foreign conquest up to and including the Roman occupation of their own day to prove that their world had really gotten that bad. So Israel welcomed the coming day of the Lord with all of its fearsome aspects because it would usher in a fresh start for God's people. Restore us, O God, repeats the psalmist 3 times to emphasize the urgency of the appeal. Jesus acknowledges that the day of the Lord will someday come and be every bit as frightening as Daniel and Isaiah imagined it. When the upheavals begin, Jesus tells his disciples, only those who endure faithfully to the end will be preserved to see the kingdom of God proclaimed throughout the world. But Jesus warns us, no one knows when these times will come, so it's important to prepare now for troubles ahead, to keep awake and to be alert. Jesus uses the example of a man going on a journey to illustrate the need to keep alert for God's appearing. The servants are exhorted to keep awake, for they don't know when the master of the house might return. But I'm drawn even more to the story in the gospel for the daily office today, that of the wise and foolish bridesmaids. We're urged to trim our lamps and supply them with enough oil to get us through the night, because it may be a long vigil before the bridegroom returns, or before the fearsome day of the Lord comes to pass. I grew up during the Cold War. In the 3rd or the 4th grade, our class was taken on a field trip to the hill surrounding our town where Minuteman missile silos stood. All across the country, there were similar installations, remote and lonely, that we were told would come to life, perhaps, spewing fire, shaking mountains, and causing earthquakes, if an enemy ever attacked us. I'm sure I wasn't very overly impressed by this. I was just glad for a day to get away from the classroom. I remembered it only much later when I saw a documentary about those soldiers who stood guard and controlled the missile defense network. They kept vigil around the clock, year after year, alert and watchful for signs of war and orders to act that would surely end the world as we knew it. Thankfully, that day didn't come. Those missile men and their political leaders were wise to keep vigil because no one knows the day or the hour. But there will always be wars and famines, and nations will always rise up against nations. Jesus tells us, however, do not be alarmed. If we keep awake and watch, we will also perceive signs of God's continuing care for us. More subtle, more intimate indications of God's love. Now, even in the days of the Cold War, some were able to see those signs of God working through agents of peace to prevent mankind from disaster. As our readings from Corinthians assures us, the Lord will continue to strengthen us even to the end. From the fig tree learn its lesson. As soon as it puts forth its leaves, you know the summer is near. This gospel reminds us to be awake to God's working in the world, even today, even in our own lives. In the times of war or pandemic, the signs of God's presence are all around us. Neighbors helping neighbors, families gathering remotely, parishioners continue to worship and share communion with each other. And soon, if we remain alert, we will be rewarded by a great sign of God's love, the birth of a child in Bethlehem.